She built his kingdom with her bare hands, and he handed it to a stranger. Luna Evelyn Hart stood in the throne room she had defended for 7 years. Maps memorized, alliances bled for, enemies buried, while Alpha King Cale Draven looked straight through her like she was furniture. The woman beside him smelled of ambition and borrowed silk. And the court watched. They always watched. Here's what nobody tells you about loyalty. It doesn't protect you. It just makes the betrayal cleaner when it comes. Stay with me until the end. You're going to want to see what she does when they finally push her too far. Hit that like and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my people are watching from tonight. The kitchen fires had been burning since before dawn. Evelyn knew the smell of them now the way she once knew the smell of the war room. Smoke and rendered fat, and the particular sourness of bread dough left too long in the cold. She stood at the long stone basin near the eastern wall, her forearms submerged to the elbow in water gone gray with lye, and she scrubbed a pot that had burned on the bottom because the second undercook had been drinking again and nobody cared enough to watch the flame. She scrubbed it clean anyway. That was the thing about her. She had never been able to leave a thing half done, not even when doing it cost her something she couldn't name. Her hands were raw. The skin at her knuckles had cracked 2 weeks ago and hadn't properly healed because the lye kept opening the splits back up, and she'd stopped wrapping them because the cloth just came undone in the water. The pain was a dull, consistent pressure now, like a low note held too long. She had stopped flinching from it. Above her, 3 floors above to be precise, the court was already gathering for the morning audience. She could feel it in the way the servants moved. The kitchen girls walked faster. The steward's boy came through twice in an hour carrying stacked silver trays, his eyes skipping over Evelyn the way everyone's eyes skipped over Evelyn now, like looking at her too long might contaminate them with whatever failure she had apparently become. 7 years. She'd spent 7 years in this palace before she ever saw the inside of this kitchen as anything other than the room she passed through on her way to somewhere that mattered. She remembered the first time she'd stood in the throne room. She'd been 22 years old and just mated to a man who hadn't been king yet, just an alpha who needed someone steady beside him because the North was fracturing along bloodlines that had been cracking for a generation. She remembered how cold the stone floors were, how the draft came through the eastern windows every morning, no matter what they stuffed into the gaps, how Kyle had stood at the center of it all with that controlled, coiled stillness he had back then, and said to her very quietly so no one else could hear, "I need you to be the thing that holds when everything else breaks." She had taken that as a vow. She had not understood at 22 that a vow only binds the person who means it. "You missed a spot." Evelyn didn't look up. She knew the voice. She'd been knowing it for 3 months, which was how long it had been since Selena Vale arrived at the palace, and Evelyn's life had quietly, methodically been dismantled from the outside in. Marta stood at the far end of the basin, arms crossed under her chest, her small eyes doing that particular thing they did when she was hoping to see a reaction. Marta was the head kitchen woman, and she had not been cruel before Selena arrived. She had been indifferent. Evelyn suspected she still was, in the private parts of her, and that the cruelty was just performance. Something she'd learned was permitted now, maybe even rewarded. "I heard you," Evelyn said. "Then do it over." Evelyn turned the pot, found the spot Marta meant, a faint gray smear near the rivet where the handle joined the iron, and scrubbed it. She put it on the rack with the others. She lifted the next one from the pile. Marta lingered for a moment, clearly wanting something more. Some flicker of shame or anger or humiliation she could carry back upstairs like a trophy. When she didn't get it, she made a sound in the back of her throat and walked away. Evelyn watched the door close behind her. She thought, "You should be conserving yourself. Every bit of heat you waste on them is heat you can't spend when it counts." She'd learned that from Kyle, actually, back when he still talked to her like a person. The audience chamber was already full by the time the bells marked the second hour. Evelyn had no reason to be there. Her name had been stripped from the duty roster 6 weeks ago. Queen Mother Vivianne's doing, executed through the chamberlain with the efficient impersonality of someone removing a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room. But Evelyn had learned in the last 3 months that information was the only currency she still controlled, and information lived upstairs, not in the kitchen. So she wore a kitchen worker's gray linen and tied her hair back and stood near the servants' corridor that ran along the east wall behind the tapestries, and she watched through the gap where the heavy cloth didn't quite meet the stone. Kael was already in his chair. He looked the same as he always had from a distance. The broad set of his shoulders, the particular stillness he maintained in public, the jaw that could have been cut from the same granite as the palace floor. Close up, he was different now. She'd noticed it the few times she'd been near enough to see his face properly. Something behind his eyes had gone flat, the way a fire goes flat when you let it burn too low for too long, and it loses the quality of heat. He looked older, not in years, in something else. Selina was standing just below and to his left, in the place Evelyn used to occupy. She was beautiful, and Evelyn had made her peace with that a long time ago, because beauty was simply a fact about Selina, like the color of the banners or the direction of the wind, and making war on facts was how kingdoms fell. What mattered wasn't the beauty. What mattered was the way Selina moved inside it, the specific calibrated deployment of every look and gesture, the way she'd learned in 3 months which angle to hold her chin so Kael could see her profile while appearing to be absorbed in the proceedings. It was craft. Evelyn could respect craft even when she hated the purpose it served. Lord Aldrich was speaking. He was Kael's chief financial advisor, or had been before the last 2 months, a compact gray-haired man with a way of standing very still when he was frightened. He was standing very still now. The Eastern allocation was moved again, Aldrich said, without a record of authorization, the 3rd time in 6 weeks. Kael's eyes didn't move. What allocation? The defense fund for the Thornwall garrison, 2,000 in silver. It cleared the treasury under a seal that matches your own, my king, but the record... Aldrich. Kael's voice was quiet. That was how you knew the temperature had dropped. Are you telling me someone is forging my seal, or are you telling me you've lost track of the records? The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough for everyone in the room to calculate what answer was safest. The records are being reviewed, Aldrich said carefully. Then review them and stop bringing me incomplete concerns. Aldrich bowed. He stepped back. Evelyn watched his face as he retreated and saw something there that she recognized because she'd been carrying a version of it for months. The specific exhaustion of a person who knows exactly what is happening and is not permitted to say so plainly. Selina touched Kael's arm. It was brief, just the light press of 2 fingers against his forearm, a gesture of comfort and deference, public enough to be seen and subtle enough to be deniable. Kael's jaw loosened slightly. Evelyn watched it happen with the focused, clinical attention of someone studying a wound. She is very good, Evelyn thought. The audience continued. Evelyn stayed behind the tapestry. She was cataloging which advisors had stopped speaking freely, which had begun hedging their reports, which garrison commanders had sent communications lately, and which had gone quiet. She'd been doing this for 2 months, building a picture in the privacy of her own mind because she had nowhere to write it down and no one to tell it to, and the picture was getting clearer and uglier with every passing week. The money was moving. 3 separate accounts that she'd overseen for 6 years had developed holes in their records. 2 of Kael's oldest trusted advisors had accepted reassignments to distant postings that removed them from the capital. The new faces in the advisory council were men she didn't know, men who'd arrived in the last 3 months with introductions supplied by Selina herself. Piece by piece, the infrastructure of the kingdom was being hollowed, and Kael was smiling at a woman who was doing the hollowing. She was halfway back down the servants' stair when she heard Queen Mother Vivianne's voice coming from the antechamber below, and the sound of it moved through Evelyn's chest like something cold and blunt. She slowed. She'd learned to move carefully in the parts of the palace that had once been hers. "Doesn't belong up here," Vivianne was saying, the precise, carrying diction of a woman who had spent 6 decades ensuring she was always heard exactly as much as she intended. "If she's found above the 2nd floor again, I want it reported directly to me." "Yes, my lady queen." That was the new chamberlain, Rennick, installed 8 weeks ago, Selina's recommendation. "And tell the kitchen girl I want those linens counted by nightfall. She finds herself with too much time if we're not careful." Evelyn stood on the stair and breathed. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, She is afraid of you. She has always been afraid of you, from the first day you came here. And cruelty is just the oldest language she knows for fear. That didn't make it not hurt. The two things coexisted in her, the clarity and the pain, and she let them both exist without giving either one more room than it deserved. She waited until the footsteps passed, then she went back down to the kitchen. Cut. The evening meal was her last work of the day. By the time it was finished, she was dry-mouthed and her feet had been hurting since midday, and the ache in her lower back had settled into that particular spot just above the left hip that told her she'd been standing too long on the wrong side. She washed her face in the kitchen basin. Cold water. She didn't close her eyes. There was a mirror in here, a small bronze one hung near the spice shelf for reasons she'd never understood. And she looked at herself in it because she'd made herself a rule when the kitchen assignment started. She would look at herself every night so she'd know what she was still carrying and what she'd lost. Tonight she looked, hair that had gone from carefully maintained to simply clean. A face that was harder than it used to be, not in the jaw but in the eyes. That particular hardening that happens when a person stops asking a thing to be different and starts working with what it is. The cracked knuckles, the way her shoulders held even when she was tired. She looked like someone in the middle of a war, she thought. That was because she was. I wasn't sure you'd still be down here. The voice came from the doorway, and Evelyn's body knew it before her mind had finished processing the sound. Her shoulders went level. Her breathing stayed even. These were not choices she made consciously. They were just what happened when Kael's voice touched the air she was breathing now. She turned. He was in the kitchen doorway, which was a thing she had not seen since the first winter they'd spent in this palace, when neither of them had known where anything was kept, and they'd wandered the corridors at 3 a.m. looking for warm food like any other hungry people. That had been a long time ago. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn to the morning audience. No armor, just the dark linen and the wolf head clasp at his shoulder. And his face in the kitchen light, the unforgiving yellow light of the tallow candles, looked older than it did from behind a tapestry. Evelyn didn't say anything. She'd learned to hold the silence and let him fill it, because the way he filled it told her things. He filled it like a man who had walked down here with something to say and was now uncertain whether he'd had the right. "How are you?" he said. She reached for a cloth and dried her hands. The pressure of it on the cracked skin was considerable, and she kept her face neutral. "I'm well," she said. "Evelyn, was there something you needed, my king?" The title landed in the space between them and sat there. She watched him absorb it. He had the grace, at least, to look briefly like it hurt him. "I wanted to speak with you about Aldrich's report," he said. "The Treasury irregularities. You told him to finish reviewing the records before bringing it to you again." "I know what I told him." There was an edge in his voice. She recognized it, the particular sharpness that meant she'd touched a place where he'd already decided he was right and didn't want to look at it more carefully. "I'm asking you, you kept the finance records before the reassignment. You knew those accounts." She looked at him for a moment. "You're going to ask me for the work you threw me out of," she thought. "You're going to do it down here in the kitchen, at night, so no one sees. And tomorrow morning you'll stand up there with her hand on your arm and pretend this conversation didn't happen." "The Eastern allocation has been moved 3 times, she said. 2,000 per transfer. The defense fund is nearly empty. At the current rate, the Thornwall garrison won't have operating funds within 60 days. She paused. "The fund for the southern border treaty payments is also short. Not dramatically, just enough that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it." Kael was very still. "How do you know this?" "Because I spent 6 years looking at those accounts every week, and because the patterns aren't random." She folded the cloth and set it down. "The transfers happen in clusters, 3 close together, then a gap, then 3 more. It's the pattern of someone who understands how audits work and is timing the movement to stay between the cycles." She met his eyes. "Someone with access to the audit schedule." A pause. "You're saying someone on the council." "I'm saying someone who knows the council's procedures well enough to work around them." She held the pause deliberately. "That's what the evidence says. I'm not in a position to say more than the evidence says." She watched him hear what she hadn't said. She watched him decide not to hear it. I'll have Rennick review the audit schedule. The name dropped into the conversation, and she didn't let anything move in her face. Rennick has been council secretary for 8 weeks, she said. He came highly recommended. By whom? And there it was. The thing she had known was coming since she heard herself start the sentence. The particular tension that meant she'd gone one step further than he'd come here prepared to allow. She saw it move through him, the tightening in his throat, the way his eyes went from uncertain to shuttered. By people who have no reason to deceive me, he said. She thought, there it is, that's where it lives. The absolute refusal to look at the thing directly because looking at it means admitting what he handed her. She said, all right, just that. She picked up the pot she'd finished drying and hung it on its hook. Evelyn, his voice had dropped again, the edge gone out of it, replaced by something rawer that she was less equipped to deal with. You know I didn't. This wasn't what I wanted. She didn't turn around. What did you want, Kael? The silence stretched. I don't know, he said finally, with the particular helplessness of someone telling the truth for the first time in a long while. I don't know what she is to me, but I didn't want this to be what you should go upstairs, Evelyn said. Her voice was level. It cost her something to keep it level, and she paid the cost without looking at the bill. The night watch changes at midnight, and the chamberlain will report your absence to whoever is keeping track of it. Another pause. She heard him breathe. She heard him decide. She heard his footsteps, and then the door, and then nothing. She stood in the kitchen with her hand still resting on the hanging pot, the iron cool under her cracked palm, and she breathed until the thing in her chest stopped pressing against her ribs. Then she finished the work. 2 levels up and at the end of the east corridor, in the study that used to belong to Kael's late father, and before that to 3 generations of Draven Alphas who'd each left their different marks on the walls, Evelyn spread the paper on the old writing desk by the window and worked in the dark, using only the moonlight and her own memory. She had found this room 6 weeks ago. Nobody used it anymore. It smelled of old wax and disuse, and the particular staleness of a closed room nobody thinks about. And she'd taken that neglect as the gift it was. The paper was old, pulled from the bottom of a supply cabinet, already yellowed at the edges. On it, in the smallest writing she could manage, she drew what she'd been building in her head for 2 months. Names, positions, arrival dates, connections she could trace and connections she could only infer. The money movement, mapped as best she could reconstruct it from the fragments Aldrich let slip and the record she'd seen before they took her off the accounts. The garrison reports that had stopped coming, the advisor reassignments, the pattern that lived in the space between the visible facts. She stared at it for a long time. The thing she kept returning to was the timing. 3 months since Selena arrived, 2 months since the first irregularities in the treasury, 6 weeks since Evelyn had been reassigned, 4 weeks since the Thornwall garrison went quiet. Selena had been in this palace for 3 months, and in that time the kingdom's financial infrastructure had developed 3 quiet holes. 2 of Kael's most trusted independent advisors had been separated from the capital. The audit schedule had been put in the hands of a man nobody had heard of 8 weeks ago, and the queen who used to manage all of it was scrubbing pots in the kitchen. That wasn't passion. That wasn't manipulation for personal gain. That was a project. Evelyn sat with that understanding for a long moment, feeling its weight settle into her. She thought about what Selena would need, the timing, the careful pace of it, the way every move served a purpose beyond the immediate one. This wasn't someone improvising. This was someone working from a plan that preceded her arrival, which meant someone had sent her, which meant someone outside the palace had a clear and structured interest in the kingdom's collapse. Evelyn pressed her palms flat against the desk and breathed. The coronation was in 19 days. She thought, if I were building towards something, I would want the coronation. You can't undo what the court witnesses. You can't strip a title that's been given in full ceremony without either a confession or a war. 19 days. She folded the paper with the careful precision of someone who had not much to lose except the contents of her own mind, and tucked it into the lining of the gray linen at the small of her back, and went back down to the dormitory room she shared with 3 kitchen women who did not speak to her, and lay down on the narrow cot in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about who owed her favors in the outer keeps, who still sent messages to her through the indirect routes she'd established when she first came to this palace as a young mate who understood that power was built in the margins, not at the center. She was thinking about what she still had. The answer, when she finished the inventory, was more than they thought. They should have paid attention, she thought. When you're trying to break someone, you should make sure you know what they're made of first. The morning of the 14th day before the coronation started, the same as every other morning, had started for 3 months. The fires, the gray water, the weight of the pot in her cracked hands. And then Marta came in from the courtyard with her face different from the way her face usually was, and said, "The Alpha King requests her in the Great Hall." The kitchen went quiet. Evelyn straightened. She set the pot down. She dried her hands. She walked out of the kitchen, still in the gray linen, her knuckles cracked and raw, and her back carrying 3 months of labor, and her spine carrying 7 years of everything else. And she walked up the stairs and through the servants' corridor, and out through the side passage into the great hall where she had stood 100 times and knew the exact pitch and echo of the ceiling. The court was assembled, all of them. The full court, the advisors and the lords and the commanders and the household staff standing in their ranks, more people than she'd seen assembled since the last formal audience she'd attended, when she'd still been on the duty roster, before all of this. Kael was on the dais. Selena stood beside him, and Queen Mother Vivienne, at the edge of the dais, was looking at Evelyn with an expression that Evelyn could not immediately read. She walked to the center of the hall and stopped. She waited. Kael looked at her for a long moment. The flat thing was back in his eyes, but underneath it was something moving, something urgent and suppressed. He said, in the carrying voice he used for formal declarations, "It has been brought to my attention that you have been conducting unauthorized correspondence with the lords of the outer keeps." The hall was very quiet. Evelyn felt the shape of it, the specific geometry of a trap, but she kept her face level and her breathing even, and she looked at him and waited. "Correspondence detailing concerns about the royal administration," Kael continued. "Concerns about my court. Concerns about—" He paused just slightly. "About persons currently serving in the palace." From the corner of her vision, she could see Selena. Selena's face was a careful composition of concern and regret, exactly calibrated. There it is, Evelyn thought. She found the letters, or she was watching the routes, or she has someone in the outer keeps who told her. She thought 19 days was always the plan. She just decided to move first. "My king," Evelyn said, and her voice came out steady in the high cold air of the hall. "I have corresponded with the lords of the outer keeps. I have done so through the same informal routes I established when you first took the throne. Because the formal routes have been compromised, I can show you the letters. I have copies of all of them." A murmur. Vivianne's expression shifted, something flickering behind the controlled surface. Kael's jaw tightened. "You admit it." "I admit I was doing the work I have always done for this kingdom." She met his eyes across the distance of the hall, and the 3 months of what he'd done to her, and the 7 years of what they'd been before that, and she said, "The question is what you're going to do about it." She watched him. She watched Selena's hand move to his arm, and she watched Kael Draven, Alpha King of the North, open his mouth and say the words that she had known were coming and had prepared for and had not, even so, quite made herself ready to hear. Remove her from the palace. The hall held its breath. Evelyn stood in the center of the floor where she had stood for 7 years, the cracked skin on her hands burning and her back straight, and something in her chest doing the quiet surgical work of finally letting go of the last thing she'd been holding. She thought, "All right," she thought, "now it's done. Now I know exactly what I have and what I don't." She thought, 14 days until the coronation. She had turned to walk toward the door, had made 3 steps toward the door, when the courier came through the far entrance at a run, his face white and his travel clothes soaked through with night-riding sweat. And he didn't stop at the guard post. He went straight to the center of the hall and dropped to his knee and said, in the loud carrying voice of a man who has ridden through darkness with a message that won't keep, "The Thornwall garrison is gone." The room stopped. The entire garrison. His breathing was ragged. He'd been on a horse since before dawn, maybe longer. The wall was breached at 3 separate points simultaneously. The duty commander is dead. The outer settlements, 2 of them are burning. He lifted his face. There are wolf warriors inside the north border, my king. Someone let them in through the gate. Evelyn did not move. She stood in the hall she'd been ordered out of, in the gray linen of a kitchen worker, with 14 days left before the coronation and the garrison that she'd been tracking for 6 weeks now gone. And she looked at the room, at Kael's face going hard with the shock of it, at Vivian's hands gripping the carved edge of the dais railing, at Selena's face, which was doing something very controlled and very careful that was almost but not quite the same as surprise. And Evelyn thought, the plan just moved. She thought, they're not waiting for the coronation. They're moving now. She thought, if I walk out that door, there is no kingdom left to save by the time someone else figures out what I already know. She stood very still in the center of the hall, and the decision she made in the next 3 seconds would carry more weight than anything she'd done in 7 years. And she made it the way she made every decision that mattered, clearly, without flinching, without asking anyone else's permission. She turned back toward the dais. 3 steps. That was how far she'd gotten toward the door before the courier's words pulled the floor out from under the room, and now she reversed those 3 steps with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is done negotiating with herself about it. The hall was still processing. That was the thing about catastrophic news. It moved through a crowd in waves, the ones nearest the courier understanding first, the understanding rippling outward through faces and bodies until it hit the walls. Lords were turning to each other. A commander near the back had his hand on his sword hilt out of reflex, which told her nothing useful except that his instincts ran ahead of his thinking. Kael was looking at the courier. Evelyn was looking at Selena. Selena's face had settled into the expression of a woman deeply alarmed, and it was a good performance. The slight parting of the lips, the hand that had been on Kael's arm, now withdrawn, as if the news had shocked it loose. But the eyes. The eyes were doing arithmetic. Evelyn had spent 3 months watching those eyes when Selena didn't know she was being watched, and she knew the difference between the calculation Selena made when she was improvising and the calculation she made when she was managing a timeline. This was the second one. She knew, Evelyn thought. She knew this was coming, and the only thing she didn't know was which morning the courier would arrive. She walked forward, not to the edge of the hall, not to a position of deference. She walked to the center of the open floor directly below the dais, where everyone in the room could see her, and she stopped there and waited. Kael's eyes moved from the courier and found her. She could see him doing it. The collision of the 2 things, the order he'd just given and the reality that had just arrived, trying to work out how they fit together in a world that had just changed shape. "My king!" Her voice was even, carrying without being loud. The Thornwall garrison held 300 soldiers and controlled the only natural pass in the northern range wide enough for a column to move through. Without it, whatever force is inside the border has uncontested movement for approximately 40 miles before they hit the first secondary fortification. She paused just long enough. "I know where the secondary fortifications are weak. I helped design the patrol routes 7 years ago. And I have been corresponding with 3 lords in the outer keeps who have standing forces and owe this crown favors." Dead quiet. "You ordered me out of this palace 30 seconds ago," Kael said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it she recognized. Not anger. Something more complicated than that. Something that had been building for weeks and was now pressed up against an emergency it couldn't afford to process. "Yes," she said. "You can carry that order out after the capital is secure." The silence in the hall had a specific texture now. Not the held breath silence of people watching a confrontation, but the focused animal quiet of a room that had just understood the stakes. Vivian had not moved from her position at the edge of the dais. Evelyn could see her in the peripheral line of her vision, could see the older woman's hand still gripping the carved railing, the knuckles pale, her face a landscape of things she wasn't saying. Kael came down off the dais. He moved the way he moved when something had cut through whatever surface he'd been operating from and reached the man underneath. Not the king's measured deliberateness, but something quicker and less managed. He crossed the floor and stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the exact quality of his eyes, the brown of them in the hall light, the particular look that meant he was deciding something. "You have 3 lords," he said quietly. Quiet enough that it was between them. 2 with standing cavalry, 1 with a fortified position at the Eastern Pass, which is where any column trying to reach the capital would have to move through if they want to arrive with supply lines intact. "How long have you been building this?" "Since the first advisor left for a posting he didn't ask for." Something moved through his face. She let him sit with it. "What do you need?" he said. "Access to the war room. The communication seals. A horse and a rider, I trust. Not one of the new appointments." She held his eyes. "And I need the people in this room to stop looking at me like I'm standing here in a kitchen uniform." A beat. Kael turned back to the hall. "Get her what she needs." The war room was on the 3rd floor, east wing, and it smelled exactly as she remembered it. Old leather, candle tallow, the faint iron and dust smell of rolled maps that had been stored in the same wooden tubes for decades. She spread the first map on the central table before anyone else had finished filing in, her cracked hands flat against the vellum, and she started talking. "The 3 breach points tell us something." She traced the line of the thorn wall with her finger. "Simultaneous breaches require coordination. That means whoever is inside the border was not improvising at the wall. They had the patrol schedule, they knew the gap windows, and they knew all 3 points at once. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from scouts." She looked up at the commanders gathering around the table. "It comes from someone with access to the garrison's internal communications." Commander Aldrich said, military Aldrich, not the finance advisor, his cousin who held the garrison oversight post, stood across the table from her with his jaw tight and his eyes doing the particular thing eyes do when a person is being told something they already suspected. "The dispatch rider from Thornwall 3 weeks ago," he said. "What about him?" "He carried a routine report, nothing notable, but he rode in through the east gate and out through the north, which isn't the return route for Thornwall." "Who authorized his entry?" Aldrich looked at her. She already knew the answer. She waited for him to say it anyway, because she wanted it said in a room full of witnesses. "The Chamberlain's office," he said. "Rennick's signature on the gate log." She heard Kael, standing to her left, take a breath and not release it cleanly. She moved on. Not because the moment wasn't significant, but because she could feel it. The way the room had just shifted, 1 degree. The way rooms shift when a thing that had been deniable becomes undeniable. And she needed the momentum going forward, not sideways into recrimination. "The eastern pass at Vorkeld is defensible," she said. "Lord Caston has 400 cavalry, and he's been waiting for a formal request for 3 weeks. I've been keeping him warm." She tapped the map. "If we get a rider to him tonight with the crown seal, he can have his force in position at the pass by dawn the day after tomorrow. That gives us a bottleneck." "And the capital's walls in the meantime," Kael said. "Thin, but we close the outer gates at nightfall, double the wall rotation, and we don't let anyone through who came to this palace in the last 4 months without a personal voucher from someone who was here before that." The silence that followed had a specific shape. She hadn't looked at Kael when she said it. She'd set it to the map, to the room, to the logic of it, and she felt the weight of it land in the air the way she'd known it would. "That's a broad order," said one of the newer commanders. She didn't know his name, which was itself information, because she used to know every commander's name. "Yes," she said, and looked at him with the patience of someone who has already done the math. "It is." He looked away first. The riders went out at midnight, 3 of them, carrying sealed dispatches under a different seal than the one that had been compromised. An old backup seal she'd pulled from the locked drawer in the war room where she'd put it 2 years ago and never mentioned to anyone, on the general principle that a backup is only useful if people don't know it exists. Kael had looked at it when she produced it and said nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. She was at the war room table at the 2nd hour past midnight, working through the supply inventory for the secondary fortifications, when she heard the door and didn't look up. "You should sleep," Kael said. "I will." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have." He pulled the chair out across from her and sat, which she hadn't expected. She had expected him to deliver whatever he'd come to deliver from the doorway and leave. Sitting meant something longer, something more deliberate. She kept her eyes on the supply inventory. "Rennick is in custody," Kael said. Good. He gave up 3 names inside the palace, 2 kitchen appointments and one of the stable masters. A pause. He also gave up a name outside the palace, someone in the Eastern Territories who has been receiving the financial transfers. She looked up then. Kael's face in the candlelight was doing something she hadn't seen on it in a long time. The particular stripped quality of a man who has been running on a constructed version of reality and has just had it taken apart in front of him. Whose name? She said. Lord Heron Voss. He let it sit there. Border territory. Old bloodline, old grievance against the Draven name, going back to my grandfather's expansion. Evelyn sat back. She knew the name. She'd flagged it, not in the papers she kept hidden, in her memory, as a possible vector 6 weeks ago, when she'd started tracking the money movement and worked backward to the territories with the most to gain from a destabilized capital. She hadn't put Heron Voss at the center of it because she'd had no direct evidence, only the logic of motive and geography. He couldn't do this alone, she said. No. He needed someone inside the palace, someone who could move freely, who knew the operational schedules, who had Kael Draven's full trust and access. She said it plainly, looking at him, and she watched him hear it. Evelyn, I'm not saying it to wound you. She kept her voice level. I'm saying it because you need to know the shape of the thing you're dealing with. Heron Voss sent her. She didn't come here for you. She came here because you were the fastest route to the throne from outside the bloodline, and the best way to clear that route was to remove the person who would have seen it coming. The candlelight moved between them. Kael's hands were flat on the table, the tendons along the back of them visible, and she recognized in the stillness of them the particular kind of stillness that means a person is holding something very tightly and very quietly so it doesn't get out. Where is she? Evelyn asked. Her chambers. Under watch. Has she been told Rennick is in custody? Not yet. Then don't tell her. Not until we know everything Rennick knows, because the moment she finds out the network is compromised, she will start closing it down from whatever end she still controls. Evelyn rose from the table and moved to the wall map and put her finger on the pass at Vorkeld. Kasten's cavalry arrives day after tomorrow. The breach force inside the border is moving, but slowly. They're trying to look like something other than an invasion until they're close enough that speed doesn't matter. That gives us roughly 36 hours before the shape of this becomes obvious to everyone in the capital and we lose control of the public narrative. The coronation. The coronation is in 13 days. She turned from the map. Selena needs it to happen on schedule. Whatever she was building toward, whatever Heron Voss is waiting to claim, it requires the formal ceremony, an abdication, an execution, a transfer of authority publicly witnessed. That's why the invasion force isn't moving fast. They don't want to take the city. They want to walk in after the legal architecture is already in place. Kael was looking at her with an expression she didn't try to interpret. How long have you known this? He said. I've known pieces of it for 2 months. The full shape of it for about 4 hours. If you'd told me, I tried to tell you. She said it without heat, without the satisfaction of being right that she'd earned and was choosing not to spend. 3 separate times, you told me I was reading the situation wrong. The 3rd time, you told me I believe the phrase was manufacturing grievance. The words sat in the room. He didn't deny them. I know what I said, he said. Quiet. Rough. Then you know why I stopped saying it. She watched him take that. She watched him carry the weight of it, which was the only thing she could offer him right now that was worth anything. Not relief, not forgiveness, just the plain fact of the thing held without disguise. Outside the narrow war room window, the capital was dark and quiet under a sky with no moon. 36 hours. 13 days. And somewhere in the east corridor of the palace she had built and defended and scrubbed pots in, a woman was sitting in a guarded room with 13 days' worth of plans running through her head. And the one thing she didn't know yet was that the woman she had dismantled piece by piece was standing in the war room with the crown seal in her hand and 36 hours to close every exit. Evelyn rolled the map. Get some sleep, she said to Kael, and her voice was the voice she used when she meant an order, not a suggestion. I need you functional, not hollowed out. The court is going to need to see an alpha king in the morning, not a man running on guilt and 4 hours of bad decision-making. He stood. He looked at her for a long moment, with that stripped quality still in his face and something else now moving underneath it that she didn't examine because there wasn't room for it yet. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry." She held it. She let it exist in the room without swatting it down, because it was real and it had cost him something to say, and she was not going to waste the truth of it just because the timing was wrong and the apology was smaller than the debt. "I know," she said. She turned back to the maps. She heard him go. She stood alone in the war room, the candles burning low, the maps spread under her cracked hands, and she thought about a woman 2 floors above her who did not know yet that the game had changed, who was still running the version of the plan that assumed Evelyn Hart had walked out the front door. The deadliest mistake you can make, Evelyn thought, is to believe someone is finished because you told them to be. She had one move before dawn that Selena wouldn't see coming. One contact inside the palace that no one had flagged because Evelyn had kept that thread so quiet for so long that it didn't exist in any record, any roster, any communication Rennick could have passed to Heron Voss. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote 3 lines. She folded it and held it for a moment, and then she pressed the backup seal into the wax at its edge. She crossed to the door and opened it, and the guard in the corridor turned, and she looked at him. Young, 4th-year appointment, one of the ones who'd been here before Selena arrived. One of the ones whose name she'd made a point of knowing. "Davan," she said. His eyes were steady. "My lady." She held out the letter. "I need this in Commander Sella's hands before the 4th bell," she said. "Not the Chamberlain's office, not the gate log. Sella's hands directly, and no one else touches it." He took it. She watched him walk. She went back inside and stood at the table in the low candle glow, and she thought about what Commander Sella was going to find when she opened that letter. What she was going to do with the evidence inside it, the evidence Evelyn had been holding back as a last resort, the evidence that didn't just implicate Rennick or the stable master or the kitchen appointments but went all the way to the name she hadn't said yet in a room full of people. The name that appeared on the forged authorization for the Thornwall garrison rotation. The name that had sent the patrol schedule to Heron Voss's courier. The name written in a hand that had been carefully copied but not perfectly. Not perfectly, because Evelyn had been looking at that handwriting for 3 months and she knew the place where the loop of the letter closed wrong. Selena Vale's real name, which was not Selena Vale. Which was Mira Voss. Heron Voss's youngest daughter, who had been inside this palace for 3 months, sleeping 2 corridors from the Alpha King, with her father's invasion force already in position before she ever arrived. Evelyn stood in the war room and let the full weight of it settle through her, the way cold settles through stone, slow and total. Then she picked up the next map. There was still work to do before dawn. The 4th bell never rang. Evelyn heard the 3rd bell mark the deep hour, and she was still at the table, the supply inventories cross-referenced against troop positions, her handwriting smaller and more compressed than it used to be because she'd trained herself to waste nothing. Not paper, not ink, not the margin of a page. She was calculating the resupply window for Caston's cavalry when the door opened without a knock. She knew before she looked up that it was wrong. People who came to the war room at this hour with good news knocked. It was Davan. His face told her everything before his mouth opened. He was pale in the specific way that means a body has gone cold from the inside, the pallor that isn't illness but shock, and his left hand was empty where the letter should still have been if Commander Sella had sent him back with a reply. "She's gone," he said. Evelyn set down the pen. "Sella. Her quarters are empty. Her horse is gone from the stable. The gate log." He stopped, and she watched him find the steadiness to finish it. "The gate log shows her horse cleared the north gate at the 2nd bell, an hour before I got there." Evelyn sat very still. She thought about the letter in Davan's hand when she'd sent him. She thought about the name inside it, written in her own careful script, with the backup seal pressed into the wax. She thought about who else in the palace had known she was in the war room tonight, had known she was building something, had known she'd sent a rider. She thought about the one thread she had kept so quiet for so long. She had been wrong. Not about the thread. about how quiet it actually was. "Did anyone else touch the letter?" she said. Devon's jaw tightened. "No, my lady. I went directly. But when I got to the corridor outside Sela's quarters, the night guard on the east wing was reassigned. Someone had pulled him from the post. There was a different man there." He paused. "I didn't know his face." Evelyn rose from the table. She moved to the wall map and stood in front of it, and she did the thing she had trained herself to do when reality shifted under her. She did not argue with it. She looked at the new shape of it plainly, the way you look at a wound to understand how deep it goes before you decide how to treat it. Sela had been her last independent asset in the palace, the one name she'd kept off every roster, off every piece of paper, out of every communication that could have been intercepted. She'd built that thread over 4 years, quietly, because she'd understood even then that the value of a failsafe was that nobody knew it existed. Somebody had known it existed. Which meant the breach wasn't just Rennick, just the Chamberlain's office, just the kitchen appointments and the stable master. The breach went deeper, into a layer she had believed was sealed. She thought, there is someone else. Someone inside the network I haven't mapped yet. Someone who has been watching me watch them. That was the thing about a well-constructed trap. You didn't feel the walls until you'd already committed your weight to the floor. "Wake the Alpha King," she said. "Tell him I need him in the war room in 10 minutes. Don't use the corridor outside the Chamberlain's office to do it." Devan went. She stood at the map alone, and she breathed, and she let herself feel the shape of the setback fully for 30 seconds. The coldness of it, the way it moved through her chest like water through cracked stone, and then she put it down. Not away. Down. There was a difference. You couldn't use what you hadn't acknowledged, but you also couldn't move carrying it. She had 12 days until the coronation. Sela was gone, which meant Heron Voss would know within hours, if he didn't know already, that his timeline had been exposed. A man whose timeline is exposed doesn't slow down. He accelerates. Tun. Kale came in still pulling on his outer coat, his hair rough from sleep or from not sleeping, and his eyes when they met hers were already hard. He'd known from Davon's face that it was bad. She could see he'd known. She told him. She watched him absorb it. He was good at stillness when he needed to be, always had been, and the stillness he held now was the kind that meant something violent was being kept at a careful distance from the surface. "Sela," he said, "she's been in this palace for 7 years. I brought her in. I trained her." Evelyn said it flatly, because there was no other way to say it. Whatever Heron Voss offered her or threatened her with, he got to her before tonight, maybe long before tonight. Or she was his from the beginning. She looked at him. 4 years ago, he said. "That's when you said you brought Sela in." She hadn't thought of it from that angle. She moved her mind to it now, turned it over, examined it. 4 years ago was before Selena, Mira Voss, had arrived. Before the Treasury irregularities, before the advisor reassignments. 4 years ago, the Draven Kingdom was stable, and Heron Voss was a name in a border registry and a grievance on a genealogical map. 4 years ago, someone had been thinking very far ahead. "He's been building this for 4 years, she said, and the words had a different weight than anything else she'd said tonight. Kael's jaw was tight enough to show the muscle working at the corner of it. The coronation was his window. His daughter on the throne, or the throne emptied and the bloodline discredited publicly. Either outcome serves him. A destabilized kingdom with a disgraced Alpha King is almost as useful as a new ruler. It creates a power vacuum the border territories can fill." She moved back to the table and stood over the map. He doesn't need to win militarily. He needs to win narratively. Court witness, formal documentation, public ceremony. The invasion force is insurance, not the primary instrument. "Then we cancel the coronation." She looked at him. "We can't cancel it," she said. "I'm the king. I can—" Canceling it tells every lord in the territory that something is wrong inside the palace walls. It invites speculation, faction building, challenges to authority from the outer keeps who are already watching to see how this crisis is handled. Canceling it hands Heron Voss the narrative without him having to do anything else. She shook her head. "We hold the coronation. We hold it on schedule. And we make sure the wrong person isn't standing beside you when it happens." The room was very quiet. She felt Kale looking at her and didn't meet his eyes because she knew what was in them, and it wasn't the moment for it. "We need to move Selena, Mira, tonight," she said. "Not to a cell. Somewhere she doesn't know. Somewhere Herren Voss can't reach her." "Why not a cell?" "Because she's the only complete picture of the plan we have access to, and she hasn't talked yet. A cell tells her we're out of patience and closes the negotiation. The right room, the right pressure." She chose the next word carefully. "She might decide her father's plan is less valuable to her than her own survival." "You want to turn her?" "I want to use what we have." He was silent for a moment. Then, "You've been thinking like this for 2 months. Longer. While you were in the kitchen." She looked at him now. She let him see it. Not the anger, she'd burned through the anger weeks ago, but the plain, unadorned fact of it. The way a person looks when they've been carrying something very heavy for a long time in a space too small to put it down. "Someone had to," she said. They moved Mira Voss at the hour before dawn. Not in chains. That was Evelyn's call, and Kyle had looked at her with something between trust and uncertainty when she made it. But he'd given the order. No chains, no guard formation, nothing that would look like a prisoner transport if anyone happened to see it in the dim pre-dawn corridor. Just Evelyn and 2 guards she had personally cleared, and a door at the end of the East Service passage that opened into a room that used to be a record storage chamber before Evelyn had it emptied 18 months ago and never told anyone why. Mira walked in front of her. She was smaller than she looked in court. That was the thing Evelyn noticed, seeing her without the performance. The architecture of her carriage, which was exceptional and which had contributed significantly to the impression of height and authority, was currently operating at reduced power. The set of her shoulders was still controlled, still precise, but the certainty had gone out of her spine sometime between being collected from her chambers and arriving at this corridor, and what replaced it was something Evelyn recognized because she'd seen it in her own reflection for 3 months. The contained stillness of a person who is calculating on the move. They were the same that way. The recognition was not comfortable. Evelyn closed the door. She told the guards to take the far end of the corridor and stay there. Then she sat down across the small table from Mira Voss and folded her hands and looked at her. Mira looked back. The silence held for a long moment, each of them taking the measure of the other at close range without the buffer of the court, without Kyle's presence, without the performance that had structured every interaction between them for 3 months. "You found Sela," Mira said. Her voice was composed. Evelyn noted it without being impressed by it. "She found herself out," Evelyn said. A beat. "She was mine 4 years before she was yours," Mira said. "I know." Something moved in Mira's face, just briefly, a flicker of recalibration. She hadn't expected that. "Your father built this for a long time," Evelyn said. "I respect the patience of it. 4 years is a long time to hold a plan quiet. He's held it for longer than that." The composure in Mira's voice was not performance now, Evelyn thought, or not only performance. It was also pride. The specific pride of someone whose work is finally being seen at its actual scale. "The Voss grievance goes back to your Alpha King's grandfather. 3 generations of watching Draven territory expand while we were told to be grateful for what we held. And your plan for addressing that grievance involves your father's warriors burning settlements in the northern territories." Mira's eyes didn't flinch. Settlements that were Voss land before Draven boots walked across them. Evelyn let that sit. She thought, she believes it. She's not reciting it. She believes the frame entirely, which makes her more dangerous than someone who is only doing it for gain, and less dangerous than someone who can be reasoned with purely on self-interest. "The settlements that burned last night had 1,200 people in them," Evelyn said. "Most of them were farmers. Some of them were children." Mira looked at her with eyes that had made their peace with something a long time ago and would not be making it again tonight. "War has costs." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it does." She let the weight of that sit between them for a moment, plain and shared, and then she moved past it because this wasn't the conversation that mattered. "Your father needs the coronation," she said. "He needs formal transfer of authority under court witness. Without it, even if his force takes the capital, he's an invader holding a city, not a rightful claimant. The legal architecture matters." Mira said nothing. The coronation is in 12 days. We're going to hold it. Evelyn's voice was even. And you're going to help me make sure it doesn't go the way your father planned it. The silence stretched. Mira looked at her with the focused, measuring look of a woman calculating survival odds. Why would I do that? Because Selah is gone, which means your father knows the timeline is compromised. A man who knows his timeline is compromised doesn't hold his position. He accelerates or he retreats, and Herren Voss doesn't retreat, which means the invasion force is moving faster than the original plan called for. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the remaining distance between her words and Mira's processing of them. And when that force arrives at this city, you are inside it, in a room your father doesn't know about, holding information about his plan that you haven't handed to anyone yet. She let that land. Your father doesn't strike me as a man who values loose threads. Mira's jaw was still set, but something behind her eyes was moving. You're asking me to betray him. I'm asking you to decide what you actually want to survive. Evelyn sat back. You've been playing a role for 3 months. You're very good at it. But a role isn't a plan for what happens after. And I don't think your father's plan for after includes a prominent position for the daughter who got compromised inside the enemy palace. The candle between them had burned low. The wax had pooled and was running, slow and irreversible, down the side of the holder. Mira looked at the table. When she looked back up, her face had changed. Not broken, not open, but moved, the way a locked room looks when someone has found the right key and the mechanism has turned without the door yet swinging. She said, "There's a name your interrogators haven't gotten from Rennick." Evelyn waited. Inside the palace. Not a new appointment. Someone who has been here since the beginning. Mira's voice was very quiet now, stripped of the court register. Someone who has been here since before you came. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table, and she did not let them move. "Tell me," she said. Mira told her. The name hit Evelyn like cold water. Not because she hadn't suspected it, somewhere in the deep, unexamined margin of her thinking, the place where the evidence too painful to follow lives. She had not followed it there because following it there meant looking at a thing she hadn't been willing to look at. She looked at it now. She stood and walked to the door, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the iron handle and her back to Mira Voss, and she breathed. She thought, this is the shape of it. This is what it actually is. She thought, everything I built this defense around has a crack in it I didn't put there. She thought, you can carry this knowledge or you can act on it. There is no version of tonight where you do both at once. She opened the door. She said to the guard at the end of the corridor, "Don't let her sleep. I'll be back before the bells." Then she walked fast, not running because running would be seen and remembered, but moving with the contained urgency of someone who has just had the floor shift under them and is choosing not to fall. She had 12 days. She had a coronation she couldn't cancel. She had an invasion force accelerating toward the capital because someone had warned them the clock was running. And the name Mira Voss had just given her belonged to someone who had access to everything Evelyn had done since she came back from the kitchen. Every rider she'd sent, every order she'd given, every sealed dispatch, including the one that told Lord Caston to bring his cavalry to the Eastern Pass. She was moving fast through the corridor, her mind ahead of her feet, when she heard it, or rather felt it, the way you feel certain sounds before you consciously register them. The low, rolling percussion of it, distant but not distant enough. The particular sound that carries through stone walls and floor and bone. War drums. Not from the east, from the north. Evelyn stopped walking. She stood in the dark corridor of the palace she had built and defended and scrubbed clean in the worst months of her life, and she understood with the precision of a person who had spent 7 years studying military geography exactly what north meant. Caston's cavalry was supposed to hold the Eastern Pass. She had sent him there. She had moved the defense there. The north was where she'd left the gap. The north was where she'd left it, because she had trusted a name that was now ash in her hands. The drums rolled through the stone under her feet, and Evelyn Hart stood at the center of a collapsing plan with 12 days until the coronation and an invasion force coming through the door she'd left unlocked. And she understood that the woman who had walked back into this palace last night, composed, strategic, in command of her own chessboard, was not the woman who was going to be able to save this kingdom. That woman's plan had just burned. What came next was going to require something raw, something the years of careful strategy and dignified endurance had kept sheathed because it wasn't safe to use it, something she'd carried in her since before she ever came to this palace and had spent 7 years learning to control. She started running. She ran. Not toward the war room, not toward Kael's chambers, toward the north wall, because the drums were coming from the north, and the only thing that mattered in the next 60 seconds was eyes on what was moving out there, the actual size of it, the actual speed, because every decision after this one would be built on that foundation, and a wrong number now meant dead people by morning. The corridor guard fell in behind her without being told. Devon. She heard his boots on the stone and didn't slow. The north battlement was 4 flights up, and the stairwell was narrow, and she took it at a pace that burned the back of her thighs, her hand dragging the wall on the turns, and she came out through the iron door at the top into cold air that hit her face like an open hand. She looked north. The torches were moving in the dark tree line, maybe 2 miles out, and she stood at the parapet and counted them with the focused mechanical attention of someone running numbers against a timeline, and the number she reached was not the number she had prepared for. She had prepared for a column, a strike force moving fast. What she was looking at was an army, not Herren Voss's personal garrison, not the advance force that had come through the Thornwall breach. This was the full weight of it, the reserves he'd held back, the force that had been staging in the Northern Territories for weeks while the breach force drew their attention east. He had never intended to come through the Eastern Pass. Caston's cavalry was sitting at the wrong door. She had sent them to the wrong door. Davin was standing beside her, and she could feel, without looking at him, the particular quality of stillness that means someone is waiting to be told what to do and is grateful someone else is doing the thinking. She looked at the torches for 3 more seconds. She counted the drum rhythm, the spacing, the pace of the movement. She calculated. Then she turned and ran back down the stairs. Kael was in the corridor outside the war room when she came through the lower passage, already armed, already moving. Someone had reached him before her, or he'd heard the drums himself. His instincts were never slow when things went physical. She didn't slow down. She grabbed his arm as she passed him, and he turned and matched her pace without question, which was the thing about Kael in a crisis. Whatever he was, in the quiet, in a fight he moved. North, she said. Full force. Not the breach column, the main body. He staged them in the Northern Territories while we chased the east. Caston is at the wrong pass. I have to call him back. That's 6 hours. I know. We don't have 6 hours. I know, Kael. She said it without breaking stride, without heat, just the flat, hard acknowledgement of a person who has already done this math and found the same answer and is moving toward the next calculation rather than sitting in the wreckage of the previous one. Which means we hold the north wall with what we have until he arrives, or we find a way to make the army out there smaller before dawn. She pushed into the war room and went straight to the map. The inner guard of the palace ran to 140 men, after the rotations and the overnight skeleton posts. The north wall was 300 yards of parapet and 2 main gates, each requiring a minimum of 20 posted defenders to hold against a sustained push. The garrison in the capital proper could supplement. She was running numbers as her finger moved on the map. Another 60, maybe 70, depending on how quickly they could be assembled in the dark. 210 men against what she'd seen in the tree line. She thought, this is not a battle of numbers. A battle of numbers, you lose. This has to be a battle of geography and time. The north gate has a choke, she said. 40 yards of approach between the outer wall and the gate itself, stone on 3 sides. If we hold the gate closed and man the approach walls, they can't bring their full width to bear. They're funneling, which means their numbers work against them as long as we hold the walls. And when they breach the gate, she looked at him. Then it's a different fight, she said. He held her eyes for a moment, and she saw something move through his face. Not fear. Kael didn't run fear the same way most people did, but something adjacent to it. Something that understood the real dimensions of what was being said. I'll take the north wall, he said. You'll take the north wall command post. You're not standing on the parapet. Evelyn, you're the Alpha King. If you die on the parapet tonight, There's no coronation, there's no succession, and Herren Voss wins without having to enter the throne room. She held his gaze without apology. Command from the post, let the wall captains work. A beat. And you, he said. I'm going back to Mira Voss, Schatz. The record room was exactly as she'd left it. The candle burned down to a stub, Mira sitting in the same chair with the particular composed stillness of someone who has been listening to the drums through the stone floor and drawing the same conclusions Evelyn had drawn 30 minutes ago. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and something in her face shifted. Not surprise, not relief, something more complicated. He moved early, Mira said. He moved when Sella cleared the gate. Evelyn sat down across from her. Which means he had a contingency for early movement. He built that contingency before you came to this palace, which means he never trusted the plan to go perfectly. She put her hands flat on the table. He was always going to do this with or without the coronation. The coronation was the clean version. This is the contingency. Mira's jaw moved, something working behind her eyes that was not the composed performance of 3 months ago and was not the controlled negotiation of the last hour, but something older and rawer than both. He didn't tell me about the North Reserves, she said quietly. No, Evelyn said. He wouldn't. The silence between them was different now. Stripped. 2 women in a small room with the drums coming through the floor, and the thing that had been political between them had gone personal in the way that only happens when the structure around people collapses, and what's left is just the humans. The name you gave me, Evelyn said. I need to act on it tonight. If you move against that person, my father's people inside the palace will know within the hour. I know. It will accelerate the attack on the North Gate. I know, Mira. She leaned forward. But that person knows where the royal heirs are sleeping tonight. And if the North Gate falls before dawn, the first thing Herren Voss needs to consolidate this as a legitimate claim is either a formal transfer or an empty bloodline. She watched Mira's face. You know what happens to the heirs if the bloodline needs to be emptied. Mira looked at her for a long moment. The nursery passage, she said, finally. East service route, 3rd level. There's a door at the far end behind the linen storage that opens to the outer kitchen yard. It's not in any plan of the palace I've seen. Evelyn thought, she knows the passage because she found it. She cataloged it as an asset. She could have used it offensively. She said, you could have used that. I know. Why didn't you? Mira looked at the table. Because I met the heirs. She said it flatly, without sentiment, as though she was reporting a fact about weather. They're 6 and 4. They didn't choose their bloodline. Evelyn stood. She moved to the door and paused. The guards stay, she said. But I'm going to have food sent, and a proper candle. She looked at Mira. You don't owe me anything for what you've told me tonight. I want to be clear about that. What you do next is your choice. Mira looked up at her with an expression she couldn't fully read and said nothing. Evelyn left. The name Mira had given her was Aldrich, not the military commander, the finance advisor, the compact gray-haired man who'd stood in the morning audience and performed Fear beautifully while telling Kael about the missing treasury funds. Performed it beautifully because he knew exactly what was missing, because he was the one who'd moved it. 6 years. He had been at this table for 6 years since before Evelyn arrived, and he had been Herren Voss's instrument the entire time, or had become it at some point during those 6 years. And the distinction no longer mattered because the result was the same. Every piece of information that moved through the finance office had moved through him first. Every audit schedule, every supply inventory, every document that crossed the council table. He knew the war room. He knew the defense plans she'd spent the night building, and he knew where the royal nursery was, because he'd been in this palace for 6 years, and the nursery was not a secret. She found him trying to leave through the west courtyard gate with a travel pack and a horse that had been saddled before the drums started. That detail mattered. He'd had the horse saddled before the drums. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the courtyard stone, and the thing that moved through his face in the second before he controlled it was not guilt and not fear, but something worse. The specific blankness of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been caught and is calculating whether running is still viable. She watched him decide it wasn't. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped 10 feet from him. The courtyard was empty except for the two of them and the horse, which was shifting its weight and pulling slightly at the bridle, smelling the drums on the air the way animals smell things people can't. "The nursery," she said. "I don't know what you—" "Don't." Her voice was very quiet and very even, the way deep water is even. Still on the surface, moving hard underneath. "I'm not here to have the conversation where you pretend. I'm here because the North Wall has 200 men on it and maybe 4 hours, and the only people in this palace who know where the royal heirs sleep tonight are the household staff and the finance advisor who has been in this building for 6 years. His jaw was set. The calculation was still running behind his eyes, slower now, more desperate. "Who sent the army through the north?" she said. "Evelyn? Who told Herren Voss the cavalry was at the eastern pass?" He looked at her. "I did," he said, and his voice came out steady, which was its own kind of terrible. The steadiness of a man who had made his peace with his choices a long time ago and was not going to unmake it now just because he'd been caught. "Because the Draven name has taken from this territory for 3 generations, and someone had to—" "Stop." He stopped. She looked at him with the 6 years of it, the weight of working beside someone and trusting the working, and she did not let what she felt about it touch her face because there wasn't room for it in this courtyard at this hour. "The nursery," she said, for the 3rd time. He said nothing. She took a step forward. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. "I'm going to ask you once more. And then I'm going to take you inside and hand you to the guard and go find the nursery on my own, which will cost me 20 minutes I don't have." She looked at him with eyes that had burned through every softer option and arrived here. "Aldrich, the children are 6 and 4. Whatever Herren Voss's grievance is, it is not their grievance." Something moved in his face. She watched it move. He told her. She got to the nursery 8 minutes before the men who'd been sent for it. She knew they'd been sent because the North Wall fight had started. She could hear it now, the particular sound of it rising over the palace roofline, metal and voice, and the structural percussion of a gate being tested. And the sound of an attack beginning is also the sound of a signal being given to everyone waiting for the signal. She took the 2 children from their beds herself, wrapped in the blankets they'd been sleeping in, the older one silent and wide-eyed and holding her hand with a grip that told her he understood something was wrong, even if he didn't understand what. The younger one still half asleep and soft-headed against her shoulder. She moved fast through the passage Mira had described, and she did not think about what she was carrying or what it meant or what would happen if she was wrong about the route. She just moved and counted doors and felt the children's warmth and weight against her and kept going. The kitchen yard was cold and dark and empty. She had one guard she trusted at the far gate, a woman named Cora who'd been on the household staff since before Evelyn arrived and who owed her nothing but had always given her honesty, which was rarer and more valuable. She put the children in Cora's arms and said 3 words, "The Mill House." Cora went without asking anything else, because she was the kind of person who understood when questions were a luxury. Evelyn stood in the kitchen yard for 3 seconds. She could hear the north wall above her, louder now. The gate was holding, but not easily. She could tell from the rhythm of the sound, the peaks and the pauses, the gate taking weight and pushing back. The wall captains were working. Cale was at the command post doing what she'd told him to do. She had to trust that. She had to trust that the 100 things she couldn't see were being handled the way she'd built this night to handle them. She went back inside. She went up to the war room and she pulled the sealed courier tube from the back of the second cabinet, the one she'd prepared 3 days ago as a contingency for a contingency she'd hoped she wouldn't need, and she broke the seal and pulled the dispatch and looked at the name on it. Lord Caston. She had sent him east, she needed him north. 6 hours away, or less if he pushed the horses hard, or less than that if there was a route he didn't know about, but she did. A supply road built in her second year that cut through the high meadow and shaved 90 minutes off the northern approach, and existed in no map that had been in the palace since Aldrich arrived. She sat down and wrote the redirect. Her hand was shaking. She noticed it and kept writing. The shaking was just her body reporting the cost of the night, The hours without sleep, and the cold, and the weight of the children, and the sprint up the stairs. It was information, not an instruction. She sealed it and got up. When she reached the war room door, it opened before she touched it. Kael stood in the doorway. His coat was split at the shoulder. There was blood on the left side of his jaw, a cut from something that had come close. Stone fragment or metal, something that had moved fast enough to open skin without him having time to duck. He was breathing hard, and his eyes were doing the thing they did in the worst moments, the thing she'd seen exactly twice in 7 years, where the stillness was gone all the way down, and what was underneath it was raw and moving. "The East Gate," he said. "They came through the East Gate, too." She stared at him. "Castan," she said. Castan's cavalry never arrived. His voice was rough, stripped of everything except the words. His advance rider came in 20 minutes ago. Castan's force was hit on the road. Someone knew his route. Someone told them the route. Evelyn stood in the doorway and felt the architecture of the night come apart in her hands, piece by piece. The redirect dispatch useless now. The cavalry gone. The north wall under pressure, and the east gate broken. 200 men on the walls and no reinforcement within 6 hours, and Herren Voss's full weight coming through both doors at once. She thought, this is the shape of a finished plan. This is what it looks like when every contingency has a counter. He has been building this for 4 years, and the counter was always going to arrive at this moment. The only question was whether I would still be standing in it. She thought, I am still standing in it. She thought, then that has to be enough. She pushed past Kael into the corridor, and he fell in beside her, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood between them. The 7 years of it, the wreckage of the last 3 months, the night they were currently surviving minute by minute, all of it compressed into the simple shared fact of moving in the same direction at the same speed. They came out onto the upper parapet of the south wing, the highest point in the palace, and she looked out over the city and saw the torches and the movement and the shape of the thing in full for the first time. The north pressure and the east breach, and the palace walls holding by discipline and will, and the specific stubbornness of men who hadn't been given permission to fail. She looked at it and calculated. She thought, there is one move left. One thing I haven't played. She turned to Kael. The coronation chamber, she said. I need the full court assembled there in the next 30 minutes. Every lord, every commander, every household witness who can walk. He looked at her. The coronation isn't for 12. It's not for the coronation. Her voice was the quietest it had been all night, and somehow that made it the most certain. I need the court assembled, and I need Mira Voss standing in front of them. And I need every piece of evidence in this palace displayed in that room before the east gate falls completely. She held his eyes. Because the gate is going to fall, Kael. We don't have the numbers to hold it. But a military victory is not the same as a legitimate claim. And Herren Voss knows it, and the one thing he cannot afford is for the assembled court of this kingdom to witness his daughter confess to the plan before his warriors reach the throne room. She didn't blink. We can't win the battle tonight, so we win the testimony. Kael looked at her for a moment that held everything. The years and the damage, and the thing he'd broken, and the thing she'd carried, and the north drums rolling through the stone beneath their feet. If it doesn't work, he said. Then we fight the rest of it with our hands, she said. But it will work. She turned from the parapet. She was already moving when she heard him, behind her, in the voice that wasn't the king's voice, but the other one, the one from before all of it. Evelyn. She stopped. I know, she said. Move. She ran. Below them, the east gate shuddered on its hinges and held and shuddered again, and the sound of it was the sound of something that would not hold much longer. And somewhere in the coronation chamber 30 minutes away, the last gamble of the night was waiting to be played, and the woman running toward it had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And that combination she had learned in 7 years of building and 3 months of burning was the most dangerous thing in any kingdom. Not an army, not a plan. A person who has already decided. The coronation chamber held its breath. Evelyn had been in this room 100 times, and it had never felt like this. The high-vaulted ceiling pressing down instead of opening up. The torchlight doing wrong things to the shadows. The assembled court standing in the irregular formation of people who had been pulled from sleep and crisis rather than arranged by protocol. Lords in riding coats. commanders with blood still drying on their armor, household staff who had never stood in this room in their lives, standing in it now because Evelyn had sent word that everyone with a pulse and a witness capacity was to be here. She stood at the center of it and waited for Mira Voss to be brought in. The drums had not stopped. The east gate was still holding. She could feel it more than hear it from this deep in the palace, the rhythmic shuddering translated through stone and floor into the soles of her feet. Every person in this room could feel it too, and the feeling was doing its work on their faces, the particular compression of features that means a person is afraid and is managing it badly. Good. Fear paid attention. Kael stood to her left, close enough that she could hear him breathing. His jaw was set and the cut on his face had stopped bleeding and dried dark, and he looked, she thought, more like an alpha king in this moment than he had in 3 months. Not because he was performing it, but because the performance had been stripped away along with everything else, and what was left was just the man, unmediated, tired and cut and standing in his own hall while his walls shook. The doors opened. 2 guards brought Mira through, and the room changed the way rooms change when the person everyone has been waiting for arrives. A subtle shift of attention, of posture, of breath. Mira walked without being pulled. Her chin was level. Her eyes moved across the assembled court with the measured sweep of someone taking inventory. And Evelyn watched that sweep and saw the moment it landed on Aldrich, standing near the back wall between 2 guards of his own, and saw something flash across Mira's face so briefly that only someone who had been studying her face for 3 months would have caught it. Not surprise. Resignation. The specific resignation of a person who has just confirmed that the exits are closed. Evelyn spoke to the room. She did not perform it. She did not use the carrying voice she'd learned in 7 years of court proceedings. She used the voice she used when she needed to be believed rather than heard. She told them. All of it, from the beginning. The structure of the plan, the 4-year timeline, the placement of assets inside the palace before Mira arrived, the treasury transfers and where the money had gone and what it had funded. She laid it out the way she had laid out supply inventories for 7 years. Clearly, sequentially, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight, because facts, when they are true and placed in the right order, are more devastating than any rhetoric. She put the forged documents on the table at the center of the room, the ones she'd retrieved from the war room cabinet in the last 30 minutes. 6 years of finance records with the specific irregularities mapped and annotated in her own hand. Aldrich's signatures against the audit schedule, the gate log with Rennick's authorization of the Thornwall dispatch rider. She put Mira's real name on the table beside them. The room did not erupt. That surprised her, the first time she'd done something in this room that surprised her. It went quiet, which was worse than erupting. The silence of a chamber full of people absorbing the shape of how comprehensively they had been taken. Then Lord Fenwick, the oldest member of the advisory council, a man who had served 3 generations of the Draven line and whose opinion moved the court the way weather moves, said from his position near the east pillar, "Is this woman denying any of it?" Everyone looked at Mira. Mira stood in the center of the room with her hands loose at her sides and her chin still level, and she looked at Evelyn, not at Fenwick, not at Kael. At Evelyn, directly, with the look of someone who has done the last calculation and arrived at the only answer left. "No," she said. The word dropped into the silence, and the silence held it, and the room breathed. "My father's grievance is real," Mira continued, and her voice was steady and stripped of everything but the plain conviction of it. "What we did to pursue it was not. The settlements that burned were not soldiers. The children in this palace are not the men who expanded the Draven border at Voss expense." She paused. "I am telling you this because it is true, not because it helps me." She looked at Evelyn one more time. Then she looked at the floor. What happened in the next 4 hours happened the way the last stages of exhausted battles always happen. Not cleanly, not dramatically, but in the grinding, unglamorous increments of people too tired to do anything except keep moving. The testimony closed the political architecture. Baron Voss's force breached the east gate at the first hour past the chamber assembly, which meant his warriors were inside the outer walls when the full court was already in possession of the documented confession. Evelyn had counted on that window, had timed the assembly against the gate assessment, and the window held. Kyle met the breach with every armed man in the capital. It was not a large battle by any historical measure. It was brutal and close and personal the way fights inside city walls always are. In the narrow streets and torchlit alleys of the outer district, two forces pressed together too tightly for strategy and too frightened for mercy. Evelyn was not on the front line of it. She was at the communication post inside the inner gate, routing information between the wall captains and the command, because the battle would be won or lost on coordination, and coordination required someone who knew all the pieces. She stood at that post for 3 hours with a cut on her forearm that she didn't remember getting and blood drying on her sleeve, and she listened and calculated and sent orders until the pattern of the information shifted, the reports coming in slower, the gaps between them longer, the tone of the runners' voices losing the edge that meant immediate danger and moving toward the particular flatness of people delivering news about something that is already over. She heard when the Voss banner came down. She heard when Herren Voss himself was taken alive in the outer district, unhorsed and surrounded, and apparently unwilling to die for a plan that had already been publicly confessed in his daughter's voice inside the palace he'd meant to claim. She heard all of it from the communication post, standing in the pre-dawn dark with her cut arm and her dried blood and her feet that had been hurting since before midnight, and when the last report came in and there was nothing left to route or coordinate. She sat down on the stone steps of the inner gate and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. Not crying, just the pressure of her palms against her eyes and the particular luxury of stopping, for 30 seconds, the work of presenting a surface to the world. Then she lifted her head and stood up and went inside. Queen Mother Vivienne was in the coronation chamber when Evelyn came back through it. The court had dispersed. The documents were still on the table. Vivienne was standing at the far end of the room near the tall windows, facing the glass, and the gray light of almost dawn was coming through and making her look older than she usually did. Or maybe it was just that the architecture she usually occupied, the absolute certainty of her own position and judgment, had vacated her face. She heard Evelyn come in and didn't turn for a moment. Then she turned. They looked at each other across the length of the coronation chamber. Evelyn waited. She was past the point of needing Vivienne to speak first. She was past most points, honestly. She was running on the stripped bare wire alertness that comes after the adrenaline has burned out, and what's left is just the person, no additives, no performance. Vivienne's eyes moved across Evelyn's face, the cut arm, the kitchen-worn hands, the gray linen she'd been wearing for 16 hours. "I was wrong about you," Vivienne said. The words had the particular sound of something that had cost a great deal to produce. Not theatrical, not performative, just plainly expensive in the way that certain truths are expensive for certain people. Evelyn let them exist in the air without rushing to meet them. "I was wrong," Vivienne said again, and this time it had more weight because she was not stopping there. "From the beginning, I looked at where you came from and I decided what you were. And I spent 7 years defending that decision against every piece of evidence that contradicted it, because I had too much invested in being right." She held Evelyn's gaze without flinching, and that steadiness, Evelyn thought, was the first genuinely courageous thing she'd seen Vivienne do. "My family is alive tonight because of you," Vivienne said. "The heirs. My son." She paused. "The kingdom." Evelyn thought about all the things she could say to that. The months in the kitchen, the public humiliations, the very specific cruelty of being stripped of every function and title while the work she'd built was simultaneously depended upon and unacknowledged. She thought about how much of that she was carrying and how much she was done carrying. She found to her own mild surprise that most of it was already down, not forgiven in the sense of forgotten, not erased, just set down. The same way she had set down other things on other nights, because carrying them cost more than the terrain ahead was worth. "I know," she said. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't the warm closing of a wound. It was just true. And Vivienne heard the difference, and the older woman's eyes went briefly bright with something that wasn't performed and then steadied again. "Whatever you want," Vivienne said. "Whatever position, whatever title, whatever authority in this court. Name it." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "I'll tell you when I've slept," she said. Something shifted in Vivienne's face. The architecture of the woman underneath the queen, briefly visible, and it looked tired and older and more honest than anything Evelyn had seen from her in 7 years. "Yes," Vivienne said. "All right." Kael found her on the north parapet as the sun came up. She had gone there without deciding to, the way you go to places that have specific gravity for you, drawn by the logic of the body rather than the deliberation of the mind. The north wall where the drums had rolled through the pre-dawn dark was quiet now. The tree line below was still, and the torches were out, and the morning was doing its slow, indifferent work of making the night's devastation look like landscape. She heard his footsteps and didn't turn. He came and stood beside her, close but not touching, looking at the same landscape. She could see in her peripheral vision that the cut on his jaw had been cleaned and bandaged. Someone had seen to it, or he'd seen to it himself in the hours while she was at the communication post. His coat was different, not the torn one, something else. He looked like a man who had been through the night and was standing on the other side of it, and the question of what he would carry from here and what he would put down was written clearly in the way he held himself, the slight forward pitch of the shoulders, the hands loose rather than fisted. He said, "Herren Voss is in custody. His commanders have surrendered terms." "I know." "Mira Voss," he paused. "I don't know what to do with her." "She chose the children over her father's plan when she didn't have to," Evelyn said. "She gave me the information that held the inner palace." She looked at the tree line. "She's not innocent, but she's not the worst of it. That's a decision for later, when you have the space to make it carefully." A silence. "I owe you more than I know how to say," he said. She thought about that. She turned it over the way she turned over most things now, without urgency, letting it find its real shape. "You owe me a different conversation than this one," she said. "Not because I saved the kingdom, because of what you did before. Those are separate debts and they don't cancel each other out." She felt him take that. She felt the weight of it settle onto him without him deflecting it, which was something, which was not everything, but was a beginning. "I know," he said. "You made me a servant in the house I built," she said. It was the first time she'd said it plainly, without managing it, without the diplomatic compression she'd applied to every conversation about it for 3 months. She said it into the morning air and it sounded exactly as bad as it was, and she did not soften it. "You let someone hollow the kingdom, and when I tried to tell you, you decided I was making it about myself." She paused. "That's what I need you to understand, not to punish you with it, because you're going to have to carry that understanding for the rest of your reign if you want to be a different kind of king than you were this year." He stood very still. "Yes," he said. "Rough. Real." "I know." She looked at him then, for the first time since he'd arrived on the parapet, and she let herself see him without the armor of the last 3 months. Not the man who had done those things, but the full person, the one she'd stood beside for 7 years, and the one he'd failed to be, and the one standing here now in the early morning with a bandaged jaw and something genuinely cracked open behind his eyes. She thought about what she had learned in the months between the throne room and the kitchen and the war room and this parapet, about the difference between what a person owes you and what you choose to give. She had spent 7 years giving without accounting. She had spent 3 months with nothing to give and had discovered, to her own surprise, that she was still herself in the absence of everything she'd built, that the scaffolding was not the structure. That was the thing the kitchen had given her, in the end. The most expensive education she'd ever received, paid for in cracked hands and cold water, and the specific dignity of a person who refuses to become what the people mistreating them need them to be. She would not return to who she had been. That woman was gone, and the loss was not entirely grief. "I'm going to want a seat at every council table," she said. "Not as Luna, not as consort, not as someone managing the household. A seat, a voice, with authority that doesn't depend on your mood or your company. Yes, and if there is ever a day when you look through me again, when you choose someone else's version of events over mine because mine is inconvenient, I will walk out that door, and the next time I'll stay gone." She said it without anger. That was what made it land the way it did. Not as a threat, not as bitterness, just as the plain and unadorned shape of what she'd become. Kael turned to look at her, and his eyes in the morning light were doing the thing she hadn't seen since before all of it, the thing she'd stopped looking for because looking for it had cost her too much. "I know," he said, for the third time. "Evelyn, I know." She held his gaze. She thought about 7 years and 3 months and 1 night and what survived them. She thought, this is not the same as it was. It is not supposed to be the same. Things that survive fires don't come out looking like they went in. They come out tempered, which is different from broken, and the distinction is everything. She let the morning sit between them for a moment, the quiet after the drums, the sky doing its slow work of turning from gray to something with color in it. Then she said, "Go and be king. There's a kingdom that needs the actual version of you today, not the version you were performing." A breath. He nodded. He turned to go and paused, and she felt the pause the way you feel weather changing. "The coronation," he said, "in 12 days. I know. I want you beside me." She looked at the tree line. "I'll be beside you," she said. "On my terms." She heard him go. She stayed on the parapet as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and the light moved down across the north meadow, the trampled grass and the doused torches, and the marks of the night written across the land in the plain vocabulary of aftermath. Below her, the city was beginning to make its ordinary sounds. Voices, movement, the specific texture of people resuming the work of living after the worst of a thing has passed. She stood in it and breathed. She thought about the girl who had come to this palace at 22 and believed that loyalty was its own protection, and she felt something for that girl that was not contempt and not nostalgia, but something older than both. The particular tenderness of a person looking back at a version of herself who did not know yet what the learning would cost. She had paid the price. She had learned the thing. The thing was this: your worth was not a function of who recognized it. It existed in the same way the North Meadow existed, whether or not anyone was looking at it, whether or not anyone had named it or claimed it or tried to take it apart. The 3 months in the kitchen had not diminished it. The humiliation in the throne room had not diminished it. The cracked hands and the gray linen and the pot scrubbing and the long cold nights had not diminished it. They had just removed everything that wasn't it. And what was left, standing here on this parapet in the morning light with a cut on her arm and her feet finally, genuinely aching, was the same thing that had always been here. A woman who could see clearly, think past her own fear, and do the necessary thing when everyone else was still deciding whether the situation was really as serious as it appeared. That was not a crown. It was not a title. It was not given and could not be taken. She had not survived this winter because she was stronger than her circumstances. She had survived it because she had refused, at every moment when the circumstances invited her to become smaller, to do so. There was a version of her that could have left, a version that could have hardened into bitterness or softened into collapse. She had walked past both of those versions every day for 3 months, and she walked past them now, and she would walk past them in whatever came next. That was what she carried. That was what they had never been able to reach. She straightened her shoulders. She turned from the parapet. She went inside to begin the work of what came next. Not as the woman who had been discarded, not as the woman who had been vindicated, but as herself, which had always been enough and was now, finally, understood to be. The kingdom had a long rebuild ahead of it. The finance records needed restructuring from the foundation. 3 outer keep alliances required formal acknowledgement. The Voss territory question would take months to resolve without creating a second generation of grievance. There were garrison commanders to replace, council positions to fill with people who had been vetted by criteria more rigorous than 3-month recommendations, a communication network to rebuild on routes that had been compromised. There was more work than any one person could hold. She had always been good at that. The north parapet was empty behind her, and the sun was fully up, and the kingdom was still standing. And Evelyn Hart walked back into the palace she had built and saved and rebuilt. And she did not look over her shoulder. She had already seen everything behind her. It was the road ahead she was interested in now.